For 99 years, Woolworths survived everything Britain threw at it. Two world wars, the Great Depression, rationing, rebuilding, decades of boom and bust. Through all of it, Woolworths stood on the high street, steady, familiar, lit up and open. Then, in 41 days, it was gone. At its peak, over 800 Woolworths stores stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the south coast of England. There was not a town of any size in Britain that didn't have one. You knew the smell the moment you walked through the door. That warm, sugary drift from the pick and mix counter near the entrance. The rows of colored sweets under the lights. The little metal scoop waiting in your hand. Children grew up making their most important decisions at that counter. 1 penny, 2 pence, choose carefully. It was the first place that gave them a choice that was entirely their own. By the 6th of January 2009, every single one of those stores was locked and dark. How does a shop that survived the Blitz fail to survive a financial crisis? How does something that woven into the fabric of British life simply disappear? Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once, in the middle of Christmas? That is the question this story sets out to answer. And the answer is more deliberate and more disturbing than most people ever knew. The story of Woolworths in Britain begins not in Britain at all, but in a small town in upstate New York. Frank Winfield Woolworth was born in 1852 in Rodman, Jefferson County, a farming community so unremarkable that even people from New York State had never heard of it. He was not a man of inherited wealth or formal education. What he had was an instinct, sharp and almost ruthless, for understanding what ordinary people wanted to buy and how much they were willing to pay for it. In 1879, Woolworth opened his first successful 5-cent store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The concept was radical in its simplicity. Everything on display, everything within reach. No glass cases, no asking a shop assistant to retrieve something from behind the counter. You walked in, you looked, you touched, you decided. And everything cost 5 cents. It worked beyond anything he had imagined. Within a decade, Woolworth stores were spreading across the eastern United States. Within 2 decades, the company was one of the largest retail operations in America. In 1913, Woolworth paid cash, entirely in cash, to construct the Woolworth Building in Manhattan, which stood as the tallest building in the world until 1930. The man from Rodman had built an empire, but Frank Woolworth had not forgotten where his family name came from. His ancestors were English, from a village called Woolley in Cambridgeshire, and he had long believed that what worked in America would work in Britain, perhaps better. In the spring of 1909, he sent word to his store managers in the United States. He needed volunteers, men who believed in the concept, men willing to cross the Atlantic and build something from nothing in a country where the idea of open display, fixed-price retail had never been tried. 3 men answered. They sailed from Hoboken, New Jersey in late May 1909 aboard the Kaiser and Auguste Victoria. They arrived in England with a mandate, a budget, and a location already chosen, the center of Liverpool on Church Street. The store opened on the 5th of November 1909. The date was Guy Fawkes Night. Fireworks already in the sky across the city. The grand opening added its own spectacle, a brass band, circus performers, and a crowd so large it spilled out onto the pavement. On that first day, customers were allowed only to browse, to look, to understand what this place was. When the doors opened for trading the following morning, the shelves were stripped bare before closing time. What made that first Liverpool store so startling was not just the price, 3 pence or 6 pence for almost everything, displayed openly on long wooden counters. It was the philosophy behind it. In 1909, most British shops kept their goods behind glass or out of reach. You described what you wanted to a shop assistant, who retrieved it, showed it to you, and waited for your decision. Shopping was a transaction between customer and gatekeeper. Woolworths removed the gatekeeper entirely. You walked in off Church Street, and the shop belonged to you. Every item in plain sight, every price clearly marked. No negotiation, no performance, no shop assistant watching your hands. Working-class families, factory workers, women managing tight household budgets. They could walk through those doors and browse without obligation, without embarrassment, without asking permission. That was the revolution. not the price. The dignity. Frank Woolworth died in April 1919, before he could see how completely his idea had taken root in British soil. But the company he set in motion had already begun its extraordinary march across the country. From Liverpool outward, town by town, high street by high street, until there was scarcely a corner of Britain that Woolworths had not reached. The question was never whether it would grow. The question, one that would not be answered for nearly a century, was whether anything built that large could ever truly be safe. By the 1950s, Woolworths was no longer simply a shop. It had become something harder to define and easier to feel, a fixed point in British life, as reliable as the post office and far more exciting. In towns across England, Scotland, and Wales, the Woolworths store on the high street was the place where ordinary life conducted some of its most ordinary and most treasured rituals. Saturday mornings, school holidays, the week before Christmas, the afternoon with nothing particular to do, and sixpence burning a hole in your pocket. At its absolute peak, in the late 1960s, there were 141 Woolworths stores operating across the United Kingdom. More than 1,000 shops in more than 1,000 towns. There was no chain in Britain, before or since, that achieved that kind of geographic saturation. If you lived in Britain and you were alive in those decades, Woolworths was part of your landscape. You did not choose to go there the way you chose a restaurant or a cinema. You simply went. The way you walked to the end of the street, it was there. It had always been there. And at the heart of it, the thing that nobody who lived through those years has ever quite managed to stop talking about, was the pick and mix counter. It sat near the entrance of almost every store, impossible to walk past without slowing down. A long display of clear containers, each one filled with a different sweet: jelly babies, sherbet lemons, cola bottles, toffees, white chocolate mice, fizzy strawberries, black jacks, fruit salads. The colors alone were enough to stop a child in their tracks. But the ritual was what made it unforgettable. You took a striped paper bag from the stack. You picked up the small metal scoop. And then you chose. Nobody chose for you. No one prepackaged your selection or told you what went together. You stood at that counter for as long as you needed, moving along the display, reconsidering, swapping one choice for another, constructing something that was entirely your own. For a child with a few pennies saved from the week, this was not a minor pleasure. It was autonomy. It was the first time many of them experienced the particular satisfaction of making something theirs from nothing. Generations of British people carry that memory with a vividness that surprises even them. The smell, warm, sweet, faintly artificial, that hit you before you even reached the counter. The weight of the bag as it filled. The moment the assistant placed it on the scales and read out the price, and you counted your coins. What was it about that counter that lodged itself so permanently in so many people? Part of the answer is simply that it was good, but the larger part is that it was theirs. Beyond the pick and mix, Woolworths was doing something that no other retailer in Britain was doing with quite the same reach or consistency. It was selling everything, and selling it cheaply enough that almost anyone could afford something. The children's clothing range, Ladybird, dressed a significant portion of British school children through the 1960s and 1970s. Mothers who had very little to spend knew that Ladybird meant reasonable quality at a price that did not require a difficult conversation at the till. School uniforms, winter coats, summer dresses, practical, affordable, and good enough. For families managing on a single wage, this was not a small thing. The music section occupied its own corner of the store, and in the 1960s and 1970s, it became, without anyone quite planning it, one of the most important places in British popular culture. 7-inch singles lined up in their sleeves, priced for the pocket money generation. This was where teenagers bought their first records, not in specialist shops they might have found intimidating, but in Woolworths, where the purchase felt as ordinary as buying a bag of sweets. The careers of entire generations of British musicians were partly built on sales through Woolworths. ABBA, The Jam, Duran Duran. The charts were shaped in part by what moved off those racks on a Saturday afternoon. Then there was the Winfield range, Woolworth's own brand, launched in 1963, which extended into an almost comic breadth of products: paint, batteries, cassette tapes, kitchen tools, small electrical items. The running joke, affectionate rather than mocking, was that you could walk into Woolworths for a tin of white emulsion and leave with everything you needed for the rest of the year. It was not far from the truth. What Woolworths understood instinctively was that its customers were not looking for luxury. They were looking for reliability. A place where the prices were honest, the stock was familiar, and nobody made you feel that you did not belong. Working class families, young couples starting out, grandmothers buying birthday presents on a fixed income. All of them found something at Woolworths that was made for them. Not adapted, not discounted from something grander, actually made for them. 3 generations passed through those doors. Grandparents who had first walked into a Woolworths in the 1930s brought their children in the 1950s and 1960s. Those children brought their own children in the 1970s and 1980s. The store did not need to advertise this continuity. It simply existed, visit after visit, decade after decade, its orange and red signage as familiar as any landmark in the town. What was it about Woolies that made people feel so entirely at home? Perhaps it was precisely this, that it never tried to be anything other than what it was. No pretension, no theater, just a well-lit shop on the high street, full of things people actually needed, at prices they could actually pay. By the early 1980s, Woolworths employed tens of thousands of people across Britain. It anchored high streets in cities and market towns alike. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a national institution. But institutions, it turns out, are not immune to the decisions made in their name. And somewhere in the decade ahead, the decisions that would eventually destroy Woolworths were already beginning to take shape. The growth of Woolworths across Britain was not the result of a grand strategic plan drawn up in a boardroom. It was something more organic than that, and in its own way, more impressive. From that first store on Church Street in Liverpool, the expansion moved outward along the railways. Wherever there was a town with a high street, a market day, and enough foot traffic to sustain a shop, Woolworths followed. The pace was relentless. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the company was opening new stores at a rate of at least one a month. Not one a quarter, not one every few weeks. One a month, month after month, year after year, for the better part of 2 decades. By the mid-1930s, Woolworths had reached almost every corner of Britain. Not just the cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Leeds, but the smaller towns too. The market towns, the seaside resorts, the industrial towns in the north where wages were low and the need for affordable goods was acute. Woolworths went where the people were, and the people in turn made Woolworths their own. The stores themselves had a consistency that was part of their appeal. Walk into a Woolworths in Newcastle, and you would find the same layout, the same signage, the same counters, the same pick-and-mix display as in a Woolworths in Bristol or Inverness. This was not accidental. The company understood, long before the concept had a name, that reliability was a form of trust. Customers did not need to orient themselves. They knew where everything was before they walked through the door. For the people who worked there, Woolworths was something the retail sector rarely offered at that scale. A steady job with a recognizable employer, accessible to people without formal qualifications. The workforce was predominantly women. Part-time positions suited mothers managing school hours. Saturday jobs suited teenagers saving for something they had seen in the music section. The company was, in the communities it served, a significant source of local employment in a way that went largely unremarked precisely because it was so constant. Then came the 1960s, and with them an ambition that stretched beyond the high street. Woolworths watched what was happening in the United States, where large out-of-town retail stores, vast, car-dependent, built on cheap land at the edge of cities, were beginning to reshape how Americans shopped. The company decided to try the same model in Britain. The result was Woolco, a format of large standalone stores positioned outside town centers, closer in spirit to what would later be called a hypermarket. The Woolco experiment ran through the 1960s into the 1980s, and it was, by any honest assessment, a failure. The British retail landscape was not yet configured for out-of-town shopping in the way that America's was. British consumers were still oriented toward the high street, toward the town center, toward the idea of shopping as part of a trip that included other errands, other stops, other people. Woolco attracted customers, but never the volume the model required, and the stores were eventually closed or converted. What the Woolco failure revealed, in retrospect, was a tension at the heart of the company that would prove increasingly difficult to resolve. Woolworths knew what it was: a high street variety store, deeply embedded in British community life. But it was also aware that the retail world was changing around it, and it could not decide whether to deepen what it did best or reinvent itself entirely. The answer it kept arriving at was to do a little of both, which meant doing neither particularly well. By 1969, the store count had reached its all-time peak of 141 branches. It was a remarkable number. More than 1,000 Woolworths stores, spread from the Shetland Islands to the South Coast, serving tens of millions of British customers every week. On paper, the company had never been larger or more powerful, but there was something embedded in that achievement that would take years to become visible. Woolworths did not own most of the buildings its stores occupied. It leased them. Long-term agreements, signed when rents were manageable, that locked the company into obligations it could not easily escape. As long as the business was profitable and growing, those leases were simply the cost of doing business. But if the business ever faltered, if revenues fell while rent obligations held firm, those same agreements would become a trap with no exit. Nobody was thinking about that in 1969. Why would they? The shops were full. The tills were ringing. Every town in Britain had a Woolworths, and every Woolworths had a queue at the pick and mix counter on a Saturday afternoon. In 1982, the British Woolworths operation was sold by its American parent company to Paternoster Stores Limited, the forerunner of what would become Kingfisher plc. It was at the time described as a new chapter for the business: independence, fresh management, the freedom to chart its own course. What it actually was, though nobody used these words at the time, was the beginning of the end of the original idea. The company that Frank Woolworth's volunteers had built from that Liverpool opening in 1909 was now in the hands of people whose interests were not the same as the interests of the customers standing in front of the pick and mix counter. The high street still looked the same. The signage was unchanged. The sweet smell near the entrance was exactly as it had always been. But in the offices where the decisions were made, something had shifted, and it would keep shifting, quietly, incrementally, and with consequences that nobody standing in those bright, familiar stores could yet imagine. There is a particular kind of institution that stops being a business and becomes something else entirely. Something that people stop evaluating and simply accept, the way they accept the post office, the local pub, the church at the end of the road. Something that exists not because they chose it this week, but because it has always been there, and its presence is part of what makes a place feel like itself. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, Woolworths had become that kind of institution. The numbers tell part of the story. At its height, Woolworths employed more than 30,000 people across the United Kingdom. It served tens of millions of customers every year. Its stores occupied prime positions on the high streets of more than 800 towns and cities. But numbers do not capture what the brand actually meant to the people who used it, week after week, decade after decade. What Woolworths meant was this: that no matter where you lived in Britain, no matter how much or how little money your family had, there was a place on your high street that was genuinely for you. Not for a version of you with more money or different tastes or a different postcode. For you exactly as you were. That was not a small thing in Britain in the 1970s. Class was not a distant abstraction. It was present in almost every retail interaction, in the way shop assistants sized up customers, in the difference between the shops on one side of the high street and the shops on the other. Woolworths was one of the very few places where none of that applied. The doors were open, the prices were honest, and the pick and mix counter did not care who your father was. The music section, by the mid-1970s, had become something close to a cultural institution in its own right. Britain was in the middle of one of the most extraordinary periods in its popular music history. Glam rock, punk, new wave, the beginnings of what would become the pop explosion of the early 1980s. And a vast proportion of the records that carried those movements into British homes were sold through Woolworths. 7-inch singles, priced for teenagers with Saturday jobs and paper rounds. The charts were not made in concert halls or on radio programs alone. They were made in significant part at the record racks in Woolworths on a Saturday afternoon. There was a jingle, simple, almost embarrassingly catchy, that ran through television advertising in this period. That's the wonder of Woolworths. It did not need to say more than that. The wonder was self-evident to anyone who had ever spent a Saturday afternoon inside one. The word wonder was exactly right. Not glamour, not luxury, not aspiration. Wonder. The low-level, reliable, entirely democratic magic of a shop that had something for everyone and charged a price that almost everyone could meet. The generational depth of the brand's hold on British life is difficult to overstate. By the 1980s, there were grandparents who had first walked into a Woolworths in the 1930s. Their children had grown up going with them. Now those children were bringing their own children, a third generation who would form their own memories, their own rituals, their own attachment to the counter and the shelves and the particular quality of light inside a Woolworths on a winter afternoon. It was not merely nostalgia that created this continuity, it was function. Woolworths was genuinely useful in a way that went beyond any individual product it sold. It was where you went for the practical things, the Ladybird school uniform, the batteries, the birthday card, the wrapping paper, the blank cassette tape, the small kitchen item you had forgotten to buy elsewhere. It absorbed the miscellaneous requirements of ordinary life and resolved them in a single visit at a price that did not require planning. In towns where it sat at the center of the high street, Woolworths functioned as a kind of civic anchor. Other shops oriented themselves around it. The footfall it generated kept the surrounding businesses viable. Its presence was, in the most literal economic sense, what kept some high streets alive. How many places in Britain could genuinely claim to have meant something to every generation alive at the same time? The answer, in the 1980s, was very few, and Woolworths was one of them. But the 1980s were also bringing changes to British retail that no amount of customer loyalty could hold back indefinitely. The supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, were expanding aggressively, moving into general merchandise, undercutting on price, and doing it at a scale that Woolworths had never faced from a single competitor. Specialist chains were carving out the categories that Woolworths had always treated as its own. HMV and Virgin were building dedicated music stores that offered a depth of catalog no Woolworths could match. Argos was systematically taking the market for affordable household goods through its catalog model. None of this was immediately catastrophic. Woolworths was large enough and trusted enough to absorb competition that would have destroyed a smaller business. Customers kept coming. The tills kept ringing. The pick and mix counter was, as it had always been, the first thing children headed for when they walked through the door. But the world around Woolworths was no longer the world that had made Woolworths great. And somewhere in the decade ahead, the gap between what the company was and what the market now required would begin to open. Slowly at first, then all at once. The wonder of Woolworths was still very much alive. What was beginning to fade, quietly and out of sight, was the business underneath it. The trouble with Woolworths was not that it stopped being loved. Right up until the final weeks, British people loved Woolworths with a warmth that most retailers would have traded anything to possess. The trouble was something quieter and more corrosive than that. Woolworths had stopped knowing what it was. Walk into a Woolworths in the late 1980s and look at what was on the shelves. Sweets, children's clothes, records and cassette tapes, toys, paint, batteries, kitchen utensils, garden tools, stationery, small electrical appliances, videos, books, confectionery. It was, in the most literal sense, everything, and that had once been the point. But the retail world of the late 1980s was no longer the retail world of the 1950s, and everything had become a problem. Because every single category that Woolworths sold now had a specialist competitor who sold it better, deeper, and increasingly at a comparable price. HMV and Virgin for music. Early Learning Center for children's toys. Boots for health and beauty. Argos for household goods and small electricals. WHS Smith for books and stationery. And underneath all of them expanding with a relentlessness that nobody had quite anticipated, the supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, quietly absorbing category after category into their weekly shop offer. Woolworths was being eaten from every direction simultaneously, and the response from the company's leadership was not a clear strategic choice, but a prolonged and ultimately fatal hesitation, an inability to decide whether to specialize or to double down on variety, whether to compete on depth or on convenience. The answer kept shifting depending on who was in charge and what quarter the results had just come in. In 1982, Woolworths had been sold by its American parent to Paternoster Stores, which became Kingfisher plc. Under Kingfisher, the company was profitable enough to survive, but the management attention was divided across a growing retail empire that included B&Q, Comet, and Superdrug. Woolworths was the oldest and most recognizable name in the group, but it was not the priority. Investment in store refurbishment was inconsistent. The interiors that had felt bright and familiar in the 1960s were beginning, by the late 1980s, to look worn at the edges. Customers noticed, not consciously perhaps. Nobody walked out of a Woolworths in 1989 thinking, this company is in strategic decline, but the accumulated small impressions registered. A slightly tired shop fit, a range that felt neither focused nor particularly exciting. The sense, difficult to articulate but easy to feel, that the shop was coasting on a reputation it was no longer fully earning. The first concrete signal that something was genuinely wrong came in 1984, when every Woolworths store in the Republic of Ireland closed. 23 stores gone in a single decision. It barely registered in the British press. The Irish operation was small, the reasoning was presented as straightforward rationalization, and the core business in Britain appeared entirely unaffected. But it was the first time in 75 years of British and Irish trading that Woolworths had retreated rather than advanced. The direction of travel had reversed, just once, just quietly, and nobody rang an alarm. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Woolworths attempted to find an answer to its identity problem through a series of strategic shifts that never quite cohered. There was a push toward entertainment, music, videos, games, which made sense given the company's heritage in the music section, but which required investment and range depth that the business was not consistently prepared to commit to. There was an attempt to sharpen the children's offering, leaning into toys and the Ladybird clothing brand. There were periodic refurbishments of stores in larger towns, designed to project a more contemporary feel, which sat awkwardly alongside the unchanged interiors of stores in smaller ones. None of it added up to a strategy. It added up to movement, which is not the same thing. Then came the experiment that, more than anything else in this period, revealed the depth of the company's confusion about its own future. In the late 1990s, under Kingfisher's direction, Woolworths launched Big W, a format of large, out-of-town stores modeled loosely on the American big box retail concept. The idea was to compete with the supermarkets on their own terms, in their own format, at the edge of town rather than on the high street. 14 Big W stores were opened. They were large, reasonably well-stocked, and almost entirely without the character that made the original Woolworths stores what they were. They were also dependent on a relationship with other Kingfisher businesses, shared logistics, combined buying power, that would prove impossible to sustain once that relationship ended. Big W ran until 2004. The sites were eventually sold to Asda and Tesco. The stores that Woolworths had built to compete with the supermarkets became, in the end, supermarkets. How long could a company keep searching for a new version of itself before the search itself became the problem? The people who felt the consequences of all this uncertainty most directly were not the executives debating strategy in the Woolworths Group headquarters on Marylebone Road. They were the staff in the stores, the long-serving employees who had watched the shop fit age without renewal, the managers who were asked to maintain standards with budgets that kept contracting, The Saturday workers who noticed that the music section was getting smaller every year, that the toy range was thinner, that the customers who used to come in 3 times a week were now coming in once. The love was still there. Walk past any Woolworths in Britain in the mid-1990s, and the customers were still coming through the door. The pick and mix counter still drew children like a magnet. The brand still meant something, still carried the weight of 100 years of Saturday mornings and school uniform runs and Christmas shopping trips. But a brand is not a business plan, and the business underneath the brand was running out of answers. In August 2001, Kingfisher made a decision that would seal Woolworth's fate, though it would take 7 more years for the consequences to become fully visible. It decided to separate Woolworths from the rest of the group entirely. A clean break, a fresh start, an independent future. What it actually was, though the full picture would only emerge later, was something far more damaging than a simple parting of ways. There is a word that appears repeatedly in the financial documentation surrounding the separation of Woolworths from Kingfisher in 2001. That word is demerger. It sounds neutral, technical, the kind of corporate language designed to describe a process without revealing what the process actually did to the people on the receiving end of it. What the demerger actually was, stripped of its language, was this. Kingfisher had grown unwieldy through the 1990s, a collection of retail brands that had never fully integrated and that investors were increasingly pressuring the group to simplify. Woolworths was the oldest and most recognizable name in the portfolio. It was also, by that point, the most difficult to sell. No buyer had emerged willing to take on a chain of that size with that many long-term lease obligations in a retail environment that was visibly becoming more competitive. So Kingfisher did what large companies do when they cannot find a buyer for a problem. They package the problem differently. Woolworths was bundled together with a collection of related businesses: Entertainment UK, the wholesale music and entertainment distributor; MVC, a specialist music retailer; and VCI, a publishing operation. The saleable assets within these businesses were stripped out or retained by Kingfisher. What remained was loaded with debt. In the spring of 2001, this package, Woolworths Group plc, was demerged from Kingfisher and floated on the London Stock Exchange. On the 28th of August 2001, Woolworths Group began trading as an independent listed company under the ticker symbol WLW. It entered that independence carrying approximately $200 million in inherited debt. It also entered it locked into a property arrangement that would prove, over the following years, to be as damaging as the debt itself. As part of the demerger settlement, 182 Woolworths stores had been sold and leased back. The transaction raised $614 million in cash that went to Kingfisher and its shareholders, not to Woolworths. In return, Woolworths received long-term lease agreements on the stores it had just sold, agreements with inflation-linked annual reviews, agreements it could not exit without enormous cost. When the demerger completed, Woolworths' annual rent obligations stood at approximately $70 million. Within a few years, as those inflation-linked reviews took effect, that figure would double. By the time the company entered its final crisis in 2008, it was paying more than $160 million a year simply to occupy the buildings its stores traded from, buildings it had once owned outright. There is a moment in the history of almost every corporate collapse where a single decision, made in a boardroom, dressed in the language of restructuring or strategic clarity, determines everything that follows. For Woolworths, that moment was August 2001. The company that emerged from the demerger was not a fresh start. It was a business that had been structurally weakened before it had drawn its first independent breath, carrying obligations it could not shed and debt it had not chosen. The staff in the stores knew none of this. The customers at the pick and mix counter knew none of this. What they knew was that Woolworths was still there, still open, still selling the same things in the same familiar way. From the outside, nothing had changed, but the foundations had been hollowed out. And the company now standing on those foundations was operating with a margin for error that was, in the most precise sense, almost none. The years between 2001 and 2008 were years in which Woolworths Group tried, with diminishing resources and increasing urgency, to find a way to make the business work. Entertainment UK, the wholesale arm that distributed music, films and games to supermarkets and other retailers across Britain, was, for much of this period, the most profitable part of the group. While the retail chain struggled to define its identity and manage its costs, EUK was generating real revenue, supplying the entertainment product that filled the shelves of every major supermarket in the country. The irony was pointed and painful. The part of Woolworths that was actually making money was not the shops that 100 years of customers had loved. It was a wholesale distribution business that most of those customers had never heard of. The retail operation, meanwhile, was caught in a deteriorating cycle that its management could see clearly but could not break. Sales of music on physical formats, the CD, the DVD, the category that had been central to Woolworth's identity since the days of the 7-inch single, were collapsing as digital downloads accelerated. iTunes had launched in the UK in 2004. Within 3 years, the market for physical music retail had changed beyond recovery. The shelves that had once held the records that defined British popular culture were now competing with a device in every pocket, and they were losing badly. The toy category, which Woolworths had invested in heavily as a strategic priority in the early 2000s, ran into Argos on one side and the supermarkets on the other, both of whom could price more aggressively and promote more effectively. The clothing range continued to decline. The miscellaneous general merchandise that had always been part of the Woolworths offer felt, by the mid-2000s, not like a strength, but like evidence of an identity that had never been resolved. In the spring of 2008, a consortium of international banks agreed to refinance the group, a deal that, had it held, might have bought Woolworths enough time to attempt a restructuring. Shortly after the refinancing was signed, the Woolworths board dismissed its chief executive of 6.5 years and announced a change in strategic direction. The banks, who had agreed terms based on the existing management and the existing plan, were furious. The trust that underpinned the refinancing agreement evaporated almost immediately. Then in September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed in New York, and the global credit markets froze. For a business in Woolworths' position, carrying $385 million in debt, paying $160 million a year in rent, and now without the confidence of its lenders, the timing could not have been worse. Trade credit insurance, which suppliers use to protect themselves against non-payment by retailers, began to be withdrawn from Woolworths' accounts. When credit insurance disappears, suppliers demand cash up front. For a retailer entering its most critical trading period, the Christmas season, when stock levels must be at their highest and cash flow is most stretched, this was not a difficulty, it was a death sentence. In November 2008, Hilco UK approached Woolworths with an offer to purchase the entire retail chain for the nominal sum of £1, taking on approximately $300 million of the group's debt in return. It was not a rescue in any conventional sense. It was a restructuring specialist identifying an asset it believed it could salvage. The offer was rejected by Woolworths banks, who calculated that the terms did not adequately protect their position. And who exactly was supposed to protect the 27,000 people who had nothing to do with any of these calculations? The answer, as events would confirm, was nobody. On the 27th of November 2008, Woolworths Group plc, the retail chain and Entertainment UK both, filed for administration. The administrators appointed were Deloitte. Their mandate was not to save the business. Their mandate was to manage its orderly disposal. 99 years and 2 months after a brass band played on Church Street in Liverpool and a crowd pressed forward to see what this new kind of shop might be, the company that Frank Woolworth's volunteers had built was placed in the hands of accountants whose job was to close it down. The high streets of Britain did not yet know what was coming. The stores were still open. The lights were still on. The pick and mix counter was still there, near the entrance, exactly where it had always been. But the decision had been made, and it would not be unmade. The 27th of November 2008 was a Wednesday. In Woolworths stores across Britain that morning, staff arrived for their shifts the way they always had, unlocking the stock room, straightening the displays, switching on the lights. The pick and mix counter was restocked. The tills were opened. The doors were unlocked at the usual time. Customers came in. It looked from the inside like any other Wednesday in November, but the news was already moving. By mid-morning, it was on the radio, on the television, on the early news websites. Woolworths Group plc had entered administration. Both the retail chain and Entertainment UK had been placed in the hands of administrators from Deloitte. The company that had stood on the British High Street for 99 years had, in the language of insolvency, ceased to be in control of its own affairs. For the staff who heard it at work, over the tannoy from a manager's office, from a colleague who had just checked their phone, the immediate experience was one of unreality. Not panic, not yet. More a kind of suspended disbelief, the feeling of being told something that the evidence around you refuses to confirm. The shop was full. The customers were still shopping. The lights were still on. And yet the thing they had just been told was apparently true. In the days that followed, the administrators worked through the options that remain. A buyer was still being sought. Someone willing to take on the stores as a going concern, to keep the staff employed and the brand alive. Several names were discussed. Several possibilities were explored. None of them materialized into anything viable. The debt was too large, the lease obligations too onerous, the retail environment too hostile for anyone with access to serious capital to conclude that acquiring 800 Woolworths stores in November 2008 represented a reasonable risk. On the 11th of December, the closing down sale began. The response from the British public was, in its way, a final and involuntary testament to what the brand had meant. People came in enormous numbers, not to rescue Woolworths, which was beyond rescuing, but to be there, to be part of the ending, to take something home from a place they had been coming to since childhood. The queues at the pick and mix counter were longer than they had been in years. People filled bags with sweets they had not bought since they were children. They were not shopping. They were saying goodbye in the only language the store had ever offered them, the language of choosing something, paying for it, and carrying it home. The discounts deepened as the weeks passed. 10%, 25, 50. By the final days, reductions of up to 90% were being offered on whatever stock remained. Fixtures and fittings, the shelving units, the display stands, the counters themselves, were sold off to whoever wanted them. The physical infrastructure of 100 years of British retail was auctioned from the shop floor, piece by piece, to members of the public who queued to buy it. There is something almost unbearable about that image. The bones of the shop being sold while the shop was still technically open. The counter that had held the pick and mix going home in the back of someone's car. The shelves that had stocked 1,000 Saturday mornings being unscrewed from the walls and carried out through the front door. On the 27th of December, 2008, the first wave of closures began. 200 Woolworths stores locked their doors that day. Staff who had worked through the closing down sale, who had served customers for weeks knowing that the end was coming, who had answered the same questions and maintained the same professional courtesy while their own futures remained entirely uncertain, arrived for what they knew would be their last shift, cashed out the tills for the final time, and walked out. There were no ceremonies, no speeches from head office, no formal acknowledgement of what was ending. The stores simply closed, one after another, the way lights go out in a building at the end of the day, methodically without sentiment until the whole thing was dark. The remaining stores continued trading through the first days of January. The administrators had set the 6th of January as the final date by which all stores would be closed. It was a Tuesday. By the time that day arrived, the shelves of most stores had been stripped almost bare. What remained was the architecture of a shop without the substance of one. Empty fixtures, bare floors, the occasional forgotten item left on a hook or tucked behind a display unit that had already been sold. The last customers to walk through the doors of the last Woolworths stores on the 6th of January 2009 did not know in most cases that they were the last. There was no announcement, no marking of the moment. They came in, looked at what little was left, and left. The staff locked up behind them. The keys were handed to the administrators. And that was the end. 27,000 people lost their jobs in those 41 days. The figure bears repeating because it is the figure that everything else in this story ultimately reduces to. Not the debt, not the demerger, not the strategic failures or the credit insurance or the decision to dismiss the chief executive at the worst possible moment. 27,000 people. The Saturday workers and the long-serving managers and the women who had worked the same counter for 20 years, and the young men and women on their first proper job, all of them gone in the space of 6 weeks in the middle of winter. The administrators, Deloitte, were subsequently censured for failing to follow the legal requirements around notifying employees at larger stores and office locations. The correct notice, under British employment law, had not been given. It was one final indignity visited upon people who had already lost everything the collapse had to take from them. In the weeks and months that followed, the empty Woolworths units sat dark on high streets across the country. Some had paper in the windows, some had security shutters pulled down, some still had the red and gold signage in place, the name still visible, the store it named no longer in existence behind it. The media had covered the collapse with genuine attention. The BBC, the broadsheets, the local papers in towns where Woolworths had been a fixture for 80 or 90 years. There were retrospectives, tributes, columns written by people describing what the shop had meant to them. The tone, almost universally, was one of mourning. Not the performative grief reserved for the famous, but something more personal and more quietly insistent. A sense that something had been taken that had not been offered up willingly, that the people who had loved Woolworths had never been consulted about its ending, and that this mattered. What do you mourn when a shop closes? Not the products, which can be found elsewhere. Not the building, which will be occupied by something else. You mourn the particular version of ordinary life that the place made possible. The Saturday morning ritual, the first record bought with saved-up pocket money, the child standing at the pick and mix counter with a striped paper bag and a metal scoop and a decision to make that felt, in that moment, entirely serious. You mourn the continuity. The fact that your grandmother went there, and your mother went there, and you went there, and you had assumed, without ever quite stating the assumption, that your children would go there too. That assumption turned out to be wrong. And in January 2009, the high streets of Britain contained, for the first time in a century, the proof of it. 800 dark windows where the lights had always been on before. The morning after the last Woolworths closed, Britain's high streets had a problem they had never had before. Not one gap, 800 gaps. In every town of any size across the country, there was now a large empty unit on the prime retail pitch of the high street, the kind of space that anchor stores occupy, the kind that smaller shops orient themselves around, the kind that generates the footfall that keeps an entire street commercially viable. 800 of them, all empty at the same time, in January, in the depths of a recession that was only just beginning to reveal its full severity. What filled those spaces said a great deal about where British retail was heading. Some units were taken by Poundland, some by Home Bargains, some by B&M. The discount sector, the retailers whose entire proposition was built on the same basic principle that Woolworths had pioneered a century earlier. The principle that ordinary people deserved decent goods at honest prices, moved into the spaces that Woolworths had left behind. There was a bitter irony in it. The stores that replaced Woolworths were, in many respects, doing what Woolworths had always done. They were just doing it without the history, without the pick and mix, and without the particular warmth that 100 years of Saturday mornings had accumulated. Other units were not filled at all. In smaller towns, in the market towns, and post-industrial communities where Woolworths had sometimes been the largest and best-known shop on the street, the empty units stayed empty. Months passed, then years. The recession made new retail investment scarce. Landlords who had once been able to command premium rents found themselves unable to attract any tenant at any price. The departure of Woolworths in these places did not just leave a gap in the shopping offer. It left a gap in the high street itself, a wound that, in some cases, never fully healed. The broader retail industry took note. The collapse of Woolworths had been described, by those who watched it happen, as the first domino of what one retail analyst called physical retail Armageddon. Never before had so many stores in so many towns closed in so short a time. The scale of the disruption was without precedent in British retail history, and it forced a reckoning, however belated, with the question of what the high street was actually for and who was responsible for keeping it alive. The lessons were not comfortable ones. A business that had been genuinely and deeply loved by the British public had been structurally compromised by the decisions of people whose interests were financial rather than retail, whose horizon was the next set of quarterly results rather than the next generation of Saturday morning shoppers. The demerger that had loaded Woolworths with debt and locked it into unaffordable leases had been, in every technical sense, a legal transaction executed by sophisticated parties. The 27,000 people who lost their jobs in 41 days had been, in every human sense, the ones who paid for it. An attempt was made to keep the name alive. In 2009, Shop Direct Group purchased the Woolworth brand and the Ladybird children's clothing brand and launched an online retail operation at woolworths.co.uk. It sold general merchandise, toys, and children's clothing through a website, trading on the recognition and affection that the name still carried. For a few years, it functioned in a modest way as a ghost of the original, familiar enough to attract visitors, diminished enough to remind them of what they were missing. In June 2015, the website closed. The online Woolworths had lasted 6 years. It turned out that what people had loved about Woolworths was not the name. It was the place. As recently as 2024, reports emerged that Woolworth Germany, an entirely separate company that had acquired the trademark in continental Europe, was considering a return of the brand to British high streets. The plans were at an early stage, and nothing concrete had been confirmed. Whether a modern Woolworths rebuilt from scratch in a retail environment utterly unlike the one that had sustained the original could carry the meaning that the name still held in British memory was a question that remained, at best, open. The workers who had lost their jobs in January 2009 did not have the luxury of waiting for answers. They found other work where they could. The retail sector absorbed some of them. Others left retail entirely. The long-serving employees, the women who had worked the same store for decades, the managers who had built their careers inside those familiar walls, found that a lifetime of experience in a company that no longer existed was not always easy to translate into the next chapter. What do we lose when a place that belonged to everyone disappears? Not because the people who used it stopped caring, but because the people who owned it stopped protecting it. The answer is not abstract. It is measurable in empty shop fronts and redundancy notices and the particular silence of a high street that used to have something at its center and no longer does. It is measurable in the memory of everyone who stood at a pick and mix counter as a child and understood, without being told, that this was a place that was genuinely for them. That understanding, that simple, democratic, entirely unpretentious sense of belonging, was what Woolworths had given Britain for 100 years. And it was what its ending, so abrupt and so avoidable, permanently took away. Picture a Saturday afternoon in Britain, sometime in the 1970s. It does not matter which town. It could be any town. A market town in Yorkshire, a coastal town in Devon, a post-industrial town in South Wales, a quiet suburb on the edge of a northern city. What matters is the high street, and on the high street, the red and gold sign above the wide glass frontage, and through the doors, the light and the warmth and the smell that reached you before you were even properly inside. That smell, warm and sweet and faintly artificial, the smell of sugar and color and possibility. It came from the pick and mix counter, which stood near the entrance the way a welcome always stands near an entrance, immediately and unmistakably itself. The clear containers filled with color, the striped paper bags stacked in a neat pile, the small metal scoop waiting. A child stands at that counter. She has been saving. She has sixpence, maybe a little more, and she has been thinking about this moment since Tuesday. She picks up the bag, she picks up the scoop, and she begins. Nobody hurries her. Nobody tells her what goes together or what she should choose. The decision is entirely hers. This sherbet lemon, not that one. 2 cola bottles, definitely the white chocolate mice. Perhaps one more of the fizzy strawberries. No, change that. The toffee instead. The bag fills slowly, deliberately, with the absolute seriousness that only children bring to small pleasures. When it is done, she carries it to the counter, watches it placed on the scale, counts out her coins, and walks out into the afternoon with something that is entirely, specifically, irreplaceably hers. That moment happened millions of times, in hundreds of towns, across decades. It was not a remarkable moment. That was precisely the point. Woolworths was never a luxury. It never tried to be. It did not sell aspiration or status or the idea that you could become something different by buying the right thing. It sold the ordinary requirements of ordinary life at prices that ordinary people could meet, in buildings that stood on the high streets of towns that might otherwise have had very little to offer the person with not much money and a list of things they needed. In doing so, it offered something that is surprisingly rare and surprisingly important. It offered belonging. Not the belonging of a club with membership requirements, not the belonging of a brand that signals something about the person wearing it, but the simple and profound belonging of a place that is for everyone, that makes no judgment about who you are or what you can afford, that simply opens its doors at the same time every morning and is there. For 3 generations of British families, Woolworths was woven into the fabric of the week: the Saturday morning shop, the school uniform run at the end of August, the Christmas toy list consulted against the stock on the shelves in November, the birthday card bought at the last minute, the batteries for the torch, the cassette tape recorded over until it wore out, the first record ever owned, carried home in a paper bag and played until the neighbors complain. These are not grand memories. They are not the memories that get recorded in history books or commemorated with plaques. They are the memories that live in the part of the mind that holds the texture of ordinary days. The weight of a paper bag, the sound of a till, the particular quality of light on a winter afternoon inside a shop that smelled of sweets and was full of people you recognized from the neighborhood. Woolworths held those memories for 100 years. It was the keeper of a particular kind of British ordinary life, and it kept them faithfully, store by store, town by town, Saturday by Saturday, for longer than most institutions of any kind managed to endure. The people who built Woolworths, from Frank Woolworth's volunteers who sailed from New Jersey in 1909 with nothing but an idea and a mandate, to the managers and buyers and floor staff who sustained it through 2 world wars and a depression and decades of change, deserved better than the ending the company received. The workers who lost their jobs in 41 days in the winter of 2008, who had given years and sometimes decades to those stores, deserved better. And the customers, the generations of British people who had made Woolworths what it was, simply by going there, week after week, year after year, because it was theirs, they deserved to have it protected with the same care they had given it. None of that happened, and the high streets that were left behind are quieter for it in ways that have never entirely been repaired. Somewhere tonight, someone is telling a child about the pick and mix counter, and about the striped paper bag and the metal scoop, and the particular joy of choosing, slowly and seriously, exactly what you wanted. The child will never stand at that counter. They will never know that smell or that weight or that specific and unrepeatable feeling of walking out of Woolworths on a Saturday afternoon with something small and sweet and entirely your own. But from the way it is described, the slight pause, the softening of the voice, the look that goes briefly somewhere else, they will understand that something real was here, something warm and ordinary and completely irreplaceable, and that it is gone.